Your preparation is the key to your reaction, especially when a natural disaster is imminent in the forecast. It could be the difference between life and death. Patrick Hardy knows a thing or two about preparing for and thriving after a disaster. He's an internationally known and respected disaster preparedness expert. He strongly believes that empowerment is the key to true resiliency and readiness for any disaster. For the last 15 years, he's worked with small businesses, Fortune 500 companies, families, and nonprofits on their disaster preparedness. He's currently in the process of writing a book to prepare anyone from any walk of life to prepare for and respond to a disaster with confidence. He joined me this week to discuss the steps we can all take to be prepared for any disaster, regardless of how big or small. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Yeah, absolutely. So, Patrick, as you all know, we're getting ready to emerge from the COVID-19 virus with restrictions lifting and sort of defining our new normal. So, I'm curious to ask you about what lessons do you think we learned from emergency preparedness standpoint going forward as a result of the virus, buddy? I'm curious.
Well, what I think is that people essentially have to learn two lessons. One of which is that no disaster is insurmountable; that you can overcome these things, and that's both from a psychological perspective and from a physical perspective. There's things that we can learn and ways with which we can ways we can improve ourselves. But the second thing that I think that is important is relying on information sources that are accurate. Because one of the problems, I think, especially during the early days of the virus, was getting information from a really good source. Because that is what we rely upon when we make decisions in disasters. And this is not only true for the virus, it's true in a lot of disasters in which I deal with. I'm in hurricane areas where they will have a storm that will pass through, and people will hear rumors of things, and you'll discover that those rumors were totally untrue, but yet people made them up anyway. And you'll also hear about it in earthquakes and in security issues where people will say there are more shooters than there really are. And there's a lot of threat information that sometimes is fairly inaccurate. And it's just because people get their information from sources that maybe aren't as credible as other ones. And that causes a lot of problems for people because then they base their decisions on bad information.
Yeah, and you say that you believe that this situation and disaster preparedness in general will help people be empowered and recognize that the post-COVID world is a chance for them to change how they view the entire process of disaster preparedness. So I'm wondering if you can tell me more about that.
Any disaster you face, I believe, is an opportunity to empower yourself. Because I think people look at disasters as a sort of massive catastrophic event, when in fact, when people look at the destruction of a disaster, I challenge my clients, I challenge people I work with to say, yes, there is destruction, but don't forget, I want you to look at not what the disaster has destroyed, but what has it revealed? What different kinds of opportunities and new things has it offered us an opportunity to actually do? I work with a restaurant up in Northern California, and one of the things I asked them when I was writing their disaster plan was, I said, well, if the disaster happens and let's say the restaurant burns down, do you want to recover at all? Do you want to go back into business at all? And she was surprised that I would ask her that. And she said, well, why do you say, why are you asking me that? And I said, the reason I'm asking you is because if the restaurant burns down, you're going to get a lot of money from the insurance company. You're going to get you're going to get a fair amount of time to be able to think about it, because the restaurant can't be rebuilt in a day. So do you really want to rebuild the restaurant at all? Or do you want to take the money and do something else with your life? And she kind of thought about it for a while. And then she actually told me that she thought about it and decided that actually if the restaurant burned down, she actually wasn't going to recover the restaurant at all. She was actually just going to let it go, because her real dream was to do something else. She wanted to be a graphics designer. She didn't want to be a chef. So she felt like her creativity outlet was a really wonderful professional avenue for her. But because she worked and ran a restaurant that had been handed to her by a relative, and she was expected to cook there, she felt a strong obligation to continue to work there. But when the disaster happened and the restaurant burned down, she actually was rather excited. And she was excited not because of the lost opportunity, but because of the door that is now opened for her. She now has an opportunity to do something brand new. And I challenge people this way in disasters all the time, is I say, regardless of what's happened, what kind of new opportunities could now be open for you? And I'm really careful with my words, because disasters obviously can lead to a lot of personal tragedies, and I don't want us to put ourselves in a position where we say, well, now that person's gone, that's okay, I'll figure out something else. I don't want it to be like that. But what I do want people to think about is, I want them to think about how can I make myself a stronger person as a result, right? Because ultimately the disaster will pass, but how do we make ourselves better? And that's what I ultimately challenge people to do.
When we examine the issue of government response when responding to a disaster, Hardy says it's important for people to become self-reliant and not relying on outside help in order to rebound.
What I tell people is people ask me all the time, what should I expect from the government in a disaster? And my answer to them is always the same: nothing. Don't expect anything from them. If you get things from them, if you're able to get aid, if you're able to get financial assistance, if you're able to get different opportunities from them, wonderful, great. But don't expect it. Because if you expect it and it doesn't happen, then that creates a very serious situation. Because the government has a lot of priorities in an emergency, and I think people forget about that. That the government is responsible for dealing with hospitals, with nursing homes, with schools, with civil administration, with law enforcement. They have a lot of responsibilities. And when people, I think, expect too much from government officials, what ends up happening is that people get themselves into trouble, because they feel as though the government has to provide them with a particular service in a disaster, when they don't realize that there are so many other people competing for the identical resources. So what I say to people is don't rely on the government to give you anything, but if they do, then it's great. If they don't, then I wouldn't worry about it, because it's something where if you can be independent, if you can be strongly independent, and if I can train you and put you in a position to be successful independently of what the government is doing in response to a disaster, then in the long run, you're going to be far better off.
And Patrick, I know that you have a definition of resiliency when it comes to disaster preparedness as it relates to empowerment as well. So I'm curious to ask you, what's your definition of resiliency when it comes to responding to a disaster?
My definition is can you make yourself stronger after the disaster occurs? Because one of the things that I make sure that I tell people is I say, if you look at the disaster purely upon the destruction, then you're never going to get and you're never going to become any stronger than you were last time. You're going to remain exactly the same. However, if you put yourself in a position where you are actually going to be stronger as a result, so you're going to strengthen your personal life, your professional life, you're going to prepare your pets better, you're going to prepare your lifestyle better, you're going to prepare yourself mentally better, you're going to do all those things together at the same time. Now, all of a sudden, you have a recipe for being successful and resilient in the long term. Because pure resiliency isn't just, gee, I made it through this disaster. I hear that far too often. What I really think needs to happen is that people need to look at the disaster and say, how can I make this empower me? How can I make this make me better? What do I need to do to make my life better and make myself stronger the next time this or any other disaster occurs?
And to that point, Patrick, I know you work with small businesses, Fortune 500 companies, and regular families when it comes to disaster preparedness. And I know you've done this for about 15 years now. So tell me about the greatest lesson you tell people about responding to a disaster. What do you learn about the resilience of people when you work with them?
The biggest lesson I teach people is that true empowerment in a disaster means that you are purely independent. So you are in a position where every element of your lifestyle, physically, mentally, financially, socially, spiritually, and intellectually, if those 6 areas of your life are prepared for a disaster, then you know what? If you're able to recover yourself and you're able to get yourself in a position where you are in control of those things without relying on external dependencies, you may actually be done with a disaster before the flames are put out. You may be done with the disaster before the floodwaters recede. As long as you have put yourself in a position where you are stronger as a result, where you know what you need to make your lifestyle successful, what it takes for it to be resilient. Those are the kinds of things that make for truly successful disaster preparedness. Because what otherwise I see is people go online and they buy things and they purchase disaster kits that don't work for them. They try to just rely on fate, or they say things like, well, I know how these work. These disasters are all the same. I had this discussion many times when I was in the Southeast in Florida. I would talk to people and say, well, I know how hurricanes work. This happens and this happens and this happens. And I said, well, that's not the way a lot of hurricanes work. In fact, a number of years ago, we had Hurricane Michael, which went from being a Category 2 to a Category 4 very, very quickly, less than 12 hours. I don't think we'd seen that. And it went west to east, and it struck northwest Florida very, very quickly. And as a result, people were caught off guard, because that was a hurricane that behaved very differently than other hurricanes. Where usually in the Atlantic hurricane areas, it usually comes from the coast of Africa, which begins to form a little storm, and then it goes into the Gulf, and then it strengthens, right? Or it's off the Atlantic Ocean near Bermuda, and then it strengthens, whatever it happens to be, right? Or near Puerto Rico. But what I say to people is don't pretend like every disaster is the same, because they are not. I mean, I grew up in an area where there's earthquakes, and even then, I used to tell people not every earthquake is the same. Earthquakes are very different. They behave differently. And we as a society have to be better prepared for them. And that's what true resiliency and empowerment is about, is looking at the disaster individually and saying, my lifestyle is prepared, because that little red backpack isn't going to do it. That's not going to recover your job, your profession. If you're a very pious person and it's important for your spirituality to, go to a faith-based community, whatever it happens to be. So those are things that I tell people, if you want true resiliency, that's what you have to do, a direct examination of your lives.
Yeah, and Patrick, I'm curious to ask you about the importance you place on unity when it comes to recovering from a disaster of a community, of a neighborhood. What level of importance importance do you place on unity?
I put a high value on community. I think it's really important, actually. When we work with our communities, when we do things on our own, one of the things that happens is that we develop the people around us and say, I'm developing a web of people who can assist me. No disaster response can be done alone, period. And so what I tell people is instead of relying on FEMA or the government, rely on friends and family to assist you. In fact, the model, the one that is in the book and the one that when it comes out, you'll be able to see it. I think you're really going to like it, actually. I'm excited about it. I hope you'll all be able to come back on and talk to you about the book, because one of the things I talk about is how to develop a community into a team. The people around you, your friends, your family, those on your social networks and various platforms, there's a way to develop those people to increase your personal resiliency. There is a way to do that. But how do we do it? Those are the things that we have to develop and examine in our life. But there is a way to accomplish it. And the way that I have sought out is, I said, look at the individualized communities in which you operate. So professionally, you have colleagues, perhaps, or you have people you work with, on a casual basis, you have clients. And then you have people interpersonally, you have social, you have sort of a larger group of interpersonal friends. You have those that are maybe only digital friends. And then you have, people who assist you financially or whatever. So these are all relationships, and you need to leverage them. But leveraging them means that you are properly working with them so that the relationship is productive during a disaster. Instead of simply saying, I need you to give me money, it's saying, what does my lifestyle require so that I can get the exact amount of money I need to be successful? Is that going to be a loan, a grant? Is that something that the banks can rely on? I mean, whatever your financial leveraging is going to be, those are going to be the things that are going to be really important. But you're absolutely right, is that I highly value communities of various kinds, because when you're able to do that and leverage those properly, you find that, you know what? You have everything you need to make your life resilient right then, because you're empowered, because your family around you is empowered. And I teach people how to do that in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about the book. Tell me what it's all about and how people can get their hands on it, Patrick.
It's tremendously exciting. It is going to be the first disaster book of its kind ever. It's not a kind of book where it prepares you for survivalist or apocalyptic kinds of things. It's a mindset change. I show you, I walk you through a disaster, from preparing for it, reacting to it, responding to it, and recovering from it, and then ultimately what I call reversing disaster, meaning actually taking the disaster and making you stronger as a result, not weaker. But I walk people through how to do that. I have a method that I apply throughout the book, and I talk to people about, why do disaster plans not work? What kind of disaster equipment do you really need? What really happens in the moments after a disaster? What are your major priorities when an emergency occurs? What decisions do you have to make? And in the recovery, I lay out exactly what I was just talking about, which is, how do you recover post-disaster and get yourself into a position where ultimately you can actually reverse it and actually make yourself a stronger, more resilient individual as a result, not a weaker one, or one where it converts you into a victim. That's what the book is about. And it is something very exciting. It will be out in March of 2023. And as I said, as time gets closer, as I said, the book will be out then, but we'll have people will be able to pre-order it, and we'll have some terrific deals. So I'm definitely excited about it.
And Patrick, what's the name of the book? Is there a name of the book yet?
We don't have a title just yet. But we will have one. We'll probably be announcing it in July. So in July, we will announce the title of the book, and we'll also share the cover of it as well. So people can take a look, and it'll be very exciting for them.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have to have you back on so we can help you promote the book for you. I look forward to that conversation.
That'd be great. I'd love it.
Giving credence to your own personal and professional legacy takes on a different definition for everyone. And this is how Hardy wants his to be remembered?
My personal life history, the way I want to be defined is as someone who is I want to democratize disaster preparedness. I want to make disaster preparedness available for everybody. Because right now, disaster planning, really effective, good disaster planning is only available to well-funded governments, Fortune 500 businesses, and elite individuals. And what I want to do instead is I want to make great disaster planning available to every single person in every element of socioeconomic strata, vulnerable populations. I want to make this so that disaster planning is something that they can use too. And I'll tell you what else. I really want people to not see disaster planning as doom and gloom. I am hopeful that by the end of my career that I can turn around and say I made it so that people saw disaster planning not as a doom and gloom, but as a method of empowerment, of making them better and stronger so that no matter what disaster they face, they have all the steps that they need to be successful. And that's what I really want to pioneer with my career.
Well, Patrick, I really want to thank you for engaging in conversation with me on this important topic of disaster preparedness and for your work in the space and for joining me this afternoon. It's most appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate it.